Before sunrise, the Ionian Sea lay still, the kind of stillness that seems to hold its breath before something enormous is about to happen. There was no wind yet to speak of, only the faint grey light rising behind the hills of western Greece, touching the water first as a rumour, then as a fact. September had come, in the year that would later be remembered as 31, before the turn of the ancient calendar into what history would call the Common Era, though no one on the water that morning thought of dates in such terms. They thought, perhaps, only of the work ahead, or of home, or of nothing at all, the mind gone quiet in the way it does before something too large to properly imagine. Strung along the horizon, so many hulls that the sea itself seemed crowded, floated the two fleets that had been gathering for this reckoning for the better part of a year. To a fisherman watching from some distant point of land, if any dared to watch, the ships would have looked less like vessels and more like a shifting wall, dark and low against the pale water, oars catching the first light in ripples that ran down each hull like something breathing. And among that wall, unmistakable even at a great distance, rose shapes that did not belong to any ordinary understanding of what a ship should be. They were not simply large, they were vast in a way that seemed to argue with the sea itself, as though someone had taken the idea of a warship and multiplied it past all reasonable limit, then set the result afloat to see if the water would hold. These were the great galley of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, ships built not merely to fight but to declare, their sides rising deck upon deck above the waterline until they resembled less a vessel of war than a fortress that had somehow slipped its foundations and gone to sea. Sailors who had spent their lives among ordinary triremes and quinqueremes, ships already respected for their size and power, found themselves staring upward at these newer giants the way a traveller might stare at a temple wall, uncertain where the top of it ended against the sky. Some of these ships, according to the accounts that survive from writers who came later and drew on records now lost, carried banks of oars in numbers that strained belief. Powered by rowers stacked in tiers so complex that the coordination required to move such a hull through open water must have seemed to anyone considering it closely almost a greater feat than any battle that followed. The historians who wrote of them used words like 8, 9, even 10 to describe the arrangement of oarsmen per section of hull, though the sources disagree on precisely how those numbers translated into rows and levels, and modern scholars continue to debate what such a designation truly meant in practice. What is not disputed is the impression these ships left on those who saw them. They were, by any measure available to the ancient world, among the largest fighting vessels ever built by human hands to that point in history, and in some respects they would remain unmatched by any wooden warship for centuries to come. It is worth pausing before the story moves further to say the name of the place where all this had gathered, because that name would soon travel far beyond this quiet gulf and into the memory of an empire not yet born. Actium, a modest stretch of coastline in northwestern Greece, near where the waters of the Ionian Sea narrowed into the Ambracian Gulf. A place that, before this September, had meant little to anyone beyond the fishermen and farmers who lived along its shore. There was a small promontory there, unremarkable in itself, and a channel through which the Gulf's calmer waters met the open sea. It was the sort of geography that history sometimes chooses almost carelessly, a strait of no great fame, destined to lend its name to an event large enough to reshape the known world. Within these waters, over the days that followed that quiet dawn, the question of who would rule the Roman world, and in what form that rule would take, was going to be decided. Not by Senate vote, not by law, but by timber, oar, and fire out on the open sea. And yet, watching that morning, no sailor on either side, no officer pacing a deck, No rower resting his arms before the work to come could have known the fuller shape of what they were part of. They understood, in the way that soldiers and sailors on the edge of a great battle usually understand, that something important was about to happen, that the outcome would matter, perhaps decide the fate of the man they served or the empire they called home. But none of them could have known that they were witnessing, in that hour, something close to the last great performance of a very old kind of warfare. The oared galley driven by human muscle, timed by drum and voice, moving across the water in the same essential fashion that ships had moved for 1,000 years before them, was approaching, without anyone quite realizing it, the end of its long reign as the deciding weapon of naval war. Sail and gunpowder, the technologies that would later render the galley an antique curiosity, still lay centuries in the future. But something in the character of naval warfare was shifting even here, in the choices being made by the two commanders whose fleets now faced each other across these waters. A shift that would only become clear with the benefit of distance and time. The kind of clarity that history grants freely, but only ever after the fact. On one side lay the ships of Antony and Cleopatra, embodying an old philosophy of naval power, one that had guided fleets since the age of the Eastern Mediterranean's earliest maritime kingdoms. That the largest ship, the most heavily built, the most heavily armed, would prevail against anything smaller that dared approach it. These were the polyremes, the towering multi-decked galleys built in the shipyards of Egypt and the eastern ports under Antony's command. Vessels meant to awe as much as to fight, floating symbols of the wealth and ambition of the woman who had helped fund and provision much of this war. Their sides, according to later accounts, were reinforced with heavy timber and in places sheathed with bronze, built to withstand ramming and to serve as platforms from which soldiers could fight almost as though on solid ground, raining missiles and grappling enemy ships close enough to board. To stand on the deck of one of these giants must have felt for a moment like standing on something permanent, something that the sea could not touch, no matter how it tried. On the other side lay a different answer to the same old question, one being tested in these very waters for what may have been the first time on such a scale. The fleet under the command of Octavian, the young heir to Caesar's name, and his admiral Marcus Agrippa, a man whose skill with ships and strategy would prove, in the days ahead, to matter more than any single vessel's size. Their galleys were lighter, faster, built along older and more modest lines, more like the swift Liburnians and smaller biremes that had served Rome's fleets for generations, vessels that could turn quickly, that could dart between the great hulls of the enemy like hounds circling something far larger and far slower than themselves. Whether this lighter fleet could hope to prevail against the towering giants across the water was a question that, on this quiet September morning, remained entirely unanswered. It was, in fact, the question upon which everything else depended. Before the story turns to the deeper history behind these ships, to the world of ambition and engineering that produced such giants, and to the strange fleeting flourishing of shipbuilding on a scale not seen before and rarely matched again, it seems only right to pause here at the beginning, in the hush before the drums began and the oars first bit into the water in earnest. Settle in, if you will, for the story of these vessels, of the men and the queen who built them, and of the empire that waited, unknowing, on the far side of this quiet dawn. There is a great deal to tell before the battle itself arrives, and the ships themselves, their timbers and their tiers of oars, their builders and their strange, brief supremacy upon the sea, deserve to be understood fully before the fighting begins. The sea, for now, remained calm. The great hulls rode low and steady on the water, waiting as the eastern sky slowly filled with color, unaware that the age of the galley, the oldest form of naval war the world had known, was gathering here for one of its final and greatest performances. To understand why such ships came to rest at anchor in that eastern bay, one must travel back through several centuries of Mediterranean history. Long before Cleopatra or Antony, long before Rome itself commanded the sea. The story of the great galley begins modestly, with the trireme, a vessel of 3 tiers of oars that had served the Greek city-states well enough to turn back the Persian fleets at Salamis. The trireme was fast, light, and disciplined, built for speed and the sudden violence of the ramming charge. For generations, it stood as the finest expression of naval war that the Mediterranean world had produced. A slender wooden blade skimming across the water, crewed by free citizens who rowed for their own cities and their own survival. But even as the trireme reached its highest form, the seeds of something larger were already being planted, and the world that would one day build ships 5 and 6 and even 10 times its size was slowly, patiently taking shape. The change did not come all at once. It came, as most great transformations do, through accumulation. A slightly larger hull here, a slightly heavier ram there, an extra file of rowers added to press some advantage in a single engagement. But the true acceleration arrived only after the death of Alexander the Great, when his vast conquests fractured into rival kingdoms ruled by his former generals and their heirs. These successor states, Macedon, the Seleucid realm stretching across Asia, and Ptolemaic Egypt along the Nile, inherited not only Alexander's territories, but something more dangerous still: his appetite for grandeur and his understanding that power, to be believed, had to be seen. In the courts of these kings, ambition took many forms. It built palaces and libraries, commissioned statues taller than temples, and funded scholars who mapped the stars. But nowhere was royal ambition made more visible, more undeniable, than in the shipyards that lined the harbors of the eastern Mediterranean, where the successors of Alexander began to compete, quite openly, over who could build the largest warship afloat. This competition unfolded gradually across the 3rd century before the Common Era, though its exact chronology remains, in places, difficult to trace with certainty. Ancient writers such as Plutarch and Athenaeus recorded details of these vessels centuries after they were built, drawing on earlier sources now lost, and their accounts sometimes disagree on names, dimensions, and dates. What is clear, however, is the general pattern. Kings who had never rowed an oar in their lives commissioned ships of a scale that pushed against the very limits of what timber and rope could sustain. Demetrius Poliorcetes, a Macedonian king remembered for his skill in siege warfare, is credited with building some of the earliest giant galleys, vessels that abandoned the trireme's slender elegance for something far heavier and more imposing. From Macedon, the fashion spread outward, carried on the same currents of rivalry that moved armies and alliances, until every court with access to a coastline and a treasury wished to possess a ship that could make ambassadors from rival kingdoms fall silent at the sight of it. It helps, before going further, to understand what these ships actually were, since the terminology used by the ancient world can easily mislead a modern listener accustomed to thinking of naval classification in terms of hull size alone. The Greeks and their successors did not name their warships according to length or tonnage, but according to the arrangement of their oars, specifically the number of rowers who pulled at each individual oar. A trireme, as the name suggests, arranged its oarsmen in 3 tiers, with 1 man to an oar on each level. But as shipbuilders sought greater power without abandoning the basic geometry of the hull, they began doubling and tripling the number of rowers assigned to each oar, rather than simply adding more tiers, which had practical limits of height and balance. A ship classified as a 5, known in Greek as a pentares and in Latin as a quinquereme, did not necessarily have 5 tiers of oars stacked one above another. Far more likely, it arranged its rowers across 2 or 3 tiers, with 2 men pulling some oars and 3 pulling others, so that the total count of rowers per side reached 5. This system, sometimes called polyreme classification by later scholars, allowed shipbuilders to scale their vessels upward almost indefinitely, at least in theory, simply by adding more rowers to existing oars rather than adding entirely new tiers to an already precarious hull. The genius of this system was matched only by its danger. A trireme's triple tiers already demanded considerable skill in construction and in the training of crews who had to row in close, cramped coordination without fouling the oars above or below them. A 5, an 8, a 10, numbers that soon appeared in the fleets of Hellenistic kings, multiplied that complexity many times over. The historian Plutarch, writing generations later, described ships in the fleet of the Ptolemies that reportedly required rowers arranged in banks so numerous and so tall that the topmost oarsman sat at a height that made the labor of rowing almost a separate art from the labor performed by the men nearest the waterline. Athenaeus, drawing on earlier writers, described a vessel commissioned by Ptolemy IV of Egypt, a 40, so enormous in its telling that modern historians have debated for centuries whether such a ship could have existed as a single hull at all, or whether it may have been a catamaran-like double hull, joined together to support a superstructure of a size no single keel could bear. The sources disagree, and no wreck of such a vessel has ever been recovered to settle the question. What can be said with confidence is that the ambition behind such reports was real, even if the precise engineering remains, and will likely always remain, a matter of informed speculation rather than certainty. It is worth pausing here to consider why kings who rarely set foot upon the sea themselves poured such staggering resources into vessels of this kind. A warship of modest size could patrol a coastline, escort merchant convoys, or fight effectively in the tight, chaotic melee of a fleet engagement. A giant polyreme, by contrast, was often too large, too slow to maneuver, and too expensive to risk in ordinary combat. Its true purpose lay elsewhere. These ships were built to be seen, anchored in a royal harbour during a festival, paraded before visiting dignitaries, rowed slowly past the docks while trumpets sounded and crowds gathered to marvel at a hull so vast it seemed to defy the very sea it rested upon. In this sense, the giant galley served the same function as an obelisk raised in a temple courtyard or a colossal statue erected at a harbour's mouth. It converted the abstract concept of a kingdom's wealth and technical mastery into something that could be looked upon directly, something that made the invisible machinery of taxation, labour and forestry suddenly, overwhelmingly visible in a single towering silhouette against the sky. The ship itself became a kind of language, spoken in timber and rope, understood by any eye that fell upon it, in any port, regardless of what tongue its sailors spoke on land. Of all the kingdoms that inherited and refined this tradition, none pursued it with more sustained dedication than the Ptolemies of Egypt, ruling from Alexandria, a city their dynasty had built into the greatest port of the ancient world. The Ptolemaic kings possessed advantages few of their rivals could match: access to the timber-rich forests of the Levant and Cyprus, control over the grain wealth of the Nile that could feed armies of shipwrights and rowers alike, and a treasury swollen by centuries of careful, sometimes ruthless, administration. Alexandria's shipyards became legendary in their own right, laboratories of naval engineering where successive generations of Ptolemaic kings competed not against foreign rivals alone, but against the memory of their own ancestors, each wishing to claim credit for having built a vessel larger than the one before it. It was into this inheritance, this long and patient accumulation of ambition, craft, and royal appetite for spectacle, that Cleopatra herself was born. The last of a line of monarchs who had, for 2 centuries, treated the sea not merely as a highway for trade or a battlefield for war, but as a kind of stage, vast and glittering, upon which the power of Egypt could be endlessly performed. The sea in this older world held a strange dual character. It was, as it had always been, a place of genuine danger, of storms that could scatter a fleet in a single night, of currents that could strand a hull upon a hidden shoal, of the constant, patient threat of rot and worm that gnawed quietly at even the best-built timber. And yet it was also, increasingly, a place of theatre, where kings who never rowed a single stroke themselves understood, with real political instinct, that the sight of a great ship gliding across calm water could shape the loyalties of subjects and the fears of rivals as surely as any victory won on land. It is this dual inheritance, the sea as danger and the sea as spectacle, that Cleopatra would carry forward into her own reign, and that would, in time, bring a fleet of towering Egyptian galleys to anchor in a quiet Greek bay, waiting for a battle that would decide far more than the fate of ships. In the years after Julius Caesar fell beneath the knives of men he had once called friends, in the middle of the Senate House he had done so much to diminish. The Roman world did not so much end as it fractured, quietly and then loudly, the way ice breaks across a lake, a hairline first, and then, without warning, the whole surface giving way beneath the weight it could no longer bear. Rome had known civil war before, had known dictators and prescriptions and the slow grinding replacement of one strong man by another. But the death of Caesar left behind a vacancy so large that no single man could fill it cleanly. And into that vacancy stepped three men who agreed, for a time, to share what none of them truly believed could be shared. The second triumvirate, as history would come to call it, was less an alliance of trust than an arrangement of convenience, stitched together by necessity and by fear of what would happen should any one of its members act alone. Octavian, Caesar's grand-nephew and adopted heir, was young, barely into his 20s when the arrangement was formed, and possessed neither the military reputation nor the personal charisma that Rome's soldiers were accustomed to following. What he possessed instead was a name and a patience that would, in time, prove far more dangerous than any sword. Mark Antony, by contrast, was already a seasoned commander, a man who had stood at Caesar's side in Gaul and at Pharsalus, whose voice carried the easy authority of the camp and the battlefield, and who understood, as Octavian did not yet fully understand, how to hold the loyalty of legions through shared hardship and shared reward. The third man in the arrangement, Lepidus, held Rome's western provinces for a time, but history would treat him gently and briefly, sidelining him from power with the same quiet efficiency that would later be turned against far greater rivals. What remained, after Lepidus faded from relevance, was a world divided in practice between two men who had once needed each other and who would, with the slow inevitability of tectonic plates grinding past one another, come to need each other's destruction instead. It is worth pausing here to resist the temptation that later ages would give in to so readily. The temptation to cast one of these men as hero and the other as villain, to flatten a complicated and very human rivalry into a morality play with a foregone conclusion. The sources that survive, many of them written under the long shadow of the eventual victor, have already done much of that flattening themselves. And a careful listener does well to remember that history is written by those who win the sea as surely as those who win the land. Antony and Octavian were, in the years after Caesar's death, simply two ambitious Roman aristocrats operating within a political system that had already shown itself capable of consuming any man who hesitated. Neither began as a monster, neither ended entirely as a hero. What divided them in the end was less a question of virtue than a question of where power in the Mediterranean world would ultimately reside. In Rome, on the western shores that had always considered themselves the center of things, or somewhere else, in an older and in some ways richer world that Rome had only recently begun to master. That older world drew Antony eastward, as it had drawn Roman generals before him and would draw Roman emperors after him, toward the wealth and sophistication of the Hellenistic kingdoms that still lingered, diminished but glittering, in the wake of Alexander's conquests centuries before. It was in this eastern reassignment of the Roman world, Antony's portion by the terms of the triumvirate's division of territory, that he found himself drawn, almost as if by the pull of some old current beneath the visible sea, toward Alexandria and toward the queen who ruled there. Cleopatra was not, when Antony first encountered her in the way that history remembers, a young or untested monarch. She had already survived court intrigue, exile, and the delicate business of keeping Egypt independent, while Rome's shadow lengthened over every kingdom in the eastern Mediterranean. What passed between Antony and Cleopatra in the years that followed has been told and retold with every degree of romance and scandal that later poets and playwrights could bring to it. But beneath the theatre of the story lay something more practical and, in its way, more interesting. An alliance between a Roman commander who needed the resources of a wealthy kingdom to fund his campaigns and consolidate his power, and an Egyptian queen who needed Roman protection and Roman military strength to secure her throne against rivals both foreign and domestic. Whatever affection grew between them, and the sources suggest it was real, whatever else it was, the alliance was built on a foundation of mutual and clear-eyed interest, the kind of arrangement that ancient rulers understood instinctively, and that modern audiences sometimes struggle to see past the romance to recognize, while Antony settled, by degrees, into the orbit of Alexandria, spending seasons at Cleopatra's court, entangling his campaigns and his finances with Egyptian support, allowing himself to be seen, in the eyes of Rome, as a man increasingly at home in Eastern luxury and Eastern customs. Octavian remained in Rome, doing the slower and less glamorous work of building a base of power that would not depend on any single dramatic victory. He was, by every account that survives, a poor soldier in the traditional sense, prone to illness before battle, and lacking the natural command presence that made men like Antony beloved by their troops. But Octavian understood something that would prove decisive. That power in Rome could be built as much through institutions, through loyalty carefully cultivated among the right men, and through the patient accumulation of political capital, as through battlefield glory. Central to this quieter strategy was Marcus Agrippa, a man of relatively modest origins, who had been Octavian's friend since boyhood, and who possessed precisely the military and organizational talent that Octavian himself lacked. Where Octavian calculated and waited, Agrippa built fleets, harbors, systems of supply and training, and it was this partnership, more than any single quality in Octavian himself, that would eventually tip the balance of the Roman world. Agrippa's name does not carry the romance of Antony's or Cleopatra's in the popular memory of these years, but the historian who traces the actual mechanics of what followed finds his hand, quiet and methodical, behind nearly every decisive Roman success at sea. The rift between Antony and Octavian did not open all at once. It widened slowly, through a series of grievances and betrayals both large and small. Broken agreements over troops and territory, dynastic marriages made and then abandoned, a growing sense on each side that the other was maneuvering toward eventual supremacy rather than continued partnership. Antony's marriage to Octavian's sister, Octavia, arranged as a gesture of reconciliation between the two men, dissolved in the face of his deepening attachment to Cleopatra, and each fresh sign of Antony's eastern entanglements gave Octavian fresh material for the campaign of persuasion he was waging, patiently and effectively, among the Roman public and the Roman Senate. It was a campaign fought less with legions in these years than with rumor and rhetoric, with Octavian carefully cultivating the image of a Rome betrayed by a general who had gone native, who had fallen under the spell of an Eastern queen, who threatened, so the accusation ran, to move the very center of Roman power away from Rome itself and toward Alexandria. Whether Antony ever seriously intended such a thing remains one of the enduring uncertainties of the period, disputed by ancient sources with their own agendas and by modern historians who must read those sources with appropriate caution. What is certain is that the accusation, true or exaggerated, proved devastatingly effective, because it touched something Romans already feared: the loss of their own centrality in a world they had only recently come to dominate. Beneath the personal drama and the political rhetoric, however, lay a harder and more material logic that made naval conflict, sooner or later, nearly unavoidable. Egypt was, by this point in its long history, still the wealthiest kingdom bordering the Mediterranean, its Nile floodplains producing grain surpluses that fed cities far beyond its own borders, its treasury swollen with gold accumulated across generations of Ptolemaic rule. Whoever controlled Egypt's resources controlled an enormous lever of power over Rome itself, a city that had grown dependent on grain imports to feed a population its own Italian farmland could no longer sustain. Antony's alliance with Cleopatra gave him access to exactly this leverage: ships, grain, gold, and the shipyards of a kingdom with centuries of maritime tradition behind it. And Octavian understood, with the same cold clarity he brought to every political calculation, that a rival who controlled Egypt's wealth and Egypt's fleets could not be allowed to remain a rival indefinitely. The sea, in this sense, was not simply the battlefield on which the final conflict would eventually be decided. It was the very thing the conflict was about: the corridor through which grain and gold and soldiers moved between Rome's world and Egypt's world. And control of that corridor would determine, in the end, which vision of Rome's future would survive. It was this quiet, grinding logic, of resources and routes rather than mere personal ambition, that would, over the years remaining before Actium, draw both men steadily and almost helplessly toward the sea, and toward the fleets that each would need to build to survive what was coming. It was to Egypt, then, that the eye of history turned, and to the long green thread of the Nile that had, for 3,000 years before Antony ever set foot on its banks, taught the people who lived along it how to build for water. The Ptolemies who ruled Egypt in these final decades of their long, glittering dynasty had inherited more than a kingdom. They had inherited a tradition of shipbuilding that reached back through the Macedonian kings who first ruled after Alexander, through the Egyptian pharaohs before them, to a people who had always understood that the river was both highway and mirror, and that whoever commanded its traffic commanded the wealth that moved upon it. By the time Cleopatra came to her throne, the shipyards of Alexandria and the smaller yards scattered along the Nile's branching mouths had become among the most accomplished in the Mediterranean world, capable of work that few other powers could match. And it was to these yards and to the deep royal treasury that stood behind them that the demands of the coming war would soon be directed. Egypt itself, for all its riches, had never been generous with timber. The Nile Valley produced palm and acacia, and little else fit for the ribs and keels of great warships. And so, as it had for centuries before her, the kingdom looked outward, north and east, across the water, to the forested slopes of Lebanon and the hill country of Cyprus, where cedar and pine grew tall and straight in stands that had been managed and harvested by generation after generation of woodsmen who understood the particular needs of shipwrights. Cedar of Lebanon, in particular, carried with it an old and almost sacred reputation. It was the timber of temples and of tombs, prized for its resistance to rot and its clean, workable grain, and merchant convoys had for centuries carried it south and west to whichever kingdom could afford it. Cleopatra's Egypt could afford it, The wealth of the Nile's harvests, converted patiently into coin and credit across the decades of Ptolemaic rule, was turned now towards securing not just enough timber for ordinary trade and building, but timber enough to raise a war fleet capable of standing beside Rome's own. An undertaking that required forests to be marked, felled, hauled to the coast, and shipped across open water long before a single keel could be laid. None of this could have been accomplished without the shipwrights themselves. And it is here that the historical record grows quiet in a way that feels, even now, like an old and familiar injustice. The men who designed the hulls, who calculated the proportions of beam to length, who knew from long apprenticeship how much curve a plank could take before it split, and how a ram's timber had to be seated deep in the keel to survive the shock of collision. These men left no names behind them, no signed contracts, no proud inscriptions carved beside their work. They exist in the record only as a collective noun, a trade, a guild passed down, through families who had likely built ships for the Ptolemies for generations, father teaching, son the particular arts of steam-bending timber and cutting mortise and tenon joints that would lock a hull together without a single iron nail. It is worth pausing before the story moves on to kings and queens and the great vessels themselves, to hold this absence in mind, to remember that behind every galley that would later be described in wonder by Roman historians, stood dozens or hundreds of unnamed craftsmen whose skill made the wonder possible at all, and who received, for their labor, no mention beyond the ships that outlived them. It was from this deep well of resource and skill that the flagship vessels of the combined fleet of Antony and Cleopatra were said to have emerged. Ships that ancient writers would later describe with a kind of oared exaggeration that has troubled historians ever since, precisely because it is so difficult now to separate genuine engineering achievement from the natural tendency of ancient chroniclers to inflate the scale of their enemies' ambitions, the better to magnify the eventual victory. Plutarch, writing more than a century after the battle itself, drew on earlier sources now lost to describe ships of extraordinary size within Antony's fleet, vessels supposedly requiring monumental effort simply to move, rowed by banks of oarsmen stacked in numbers that strain belief when measured against what is known of naval architecture from other periods. Other ancient writers, describing the general character of the era's shipbuilding, rather than Actium specifically, spoke of vessels rated as tens, a shorthand referring not necessarily to 10 rows of oars stacked vertically, an arrangement that would have made a hull impossibly tall and unstable, but more likely to 10 men working the oars at each rowing station, their combined strength driving a single enormous blade through the water. Whether any ship at Actium itself reached such extremes remains, even after generations of careful study, an open question. And historians today are considerably more cautious than their ancient sources were about accepting these figures at face value. What can be said with more confidence is that the fleet Antony and Cleopatra assembled included vessels considerably larger than the standard warships of the age, built with more decks, thicker planking, and a heavier bronze-clad ram than the lean triremes and quadrireme that had once formed the backbone of Mediterranean navies. These were ships designed less for the quick, darting maneuvers that had characterized naval warfare in earlier centuries, and more for raw endurance. Floating fortresses meant to absorb blows that would splinter a smaller vessel, to carry marines and archers and small catapults in numbers sufficient to turn a sea battle into something closer to a land battle fought on water. Some of these great ships, if the ancient accounts are to be believed even partially, may have stood higher above the waterline than any building in a small town, their upper decks crowded with towers and platforms from which soldiers could rain missiles down onto the more modest vessels below them. A design philosophy that valued mass and height over speed, betting that no lighter ship could survive a direct collision with a hull built on this scale. whatever it might lack in nimbleness. To picture the construction of such vessels is to picture, first and above all else, an extraordinary quantity of ordinary labor stretched across an extraordinary length of time. Before a single strake of planking could be shaped, timber that had traveled by ship from the forests of Lebanon or Cyprus had to be unloaded, sorted, and seasoned, a process that alone could consume the better part of a year, since green wood used too soon would warp and crack under the strain of the sea. Once the wood was ready, the work began with the keel itself, a single long spine laid down upon blocks in the shipyard, around which the entire vast structure of the hull would eventually rise. From that spine, the frames were raised, curved ribs shaped by steam and fire, and the patient, repeated pressure of a shipwright's hands, each one tested and adjusted before it was locked into place. Then came the long, grinding labor of planking, plank after plank, fitted edge to edge and secured not by nails, but by mortise and tenon joinery. Thousands of small wooden pins driven through drilled holes to bind the hull into something that behaved, in the end, almost like a single continuous piece of wood, rather than a construction of many separate pieces. The air of a shipyard building vessels of this size would have carried, at almost every hour of the working day, the sharp, bright smell of pine pitch, boiled and applied hot to seal the seams between planks against the intrusion of seawater, mingled with the drier, resinous smell of sawdust rising in drifts around the feet of the carpenters. Ropes as thick as a man's forearm were coiled everywhere, used to hoist timbers too heavy for men alone to lift, worked by teams pulling in rhythm to the calls of an overseer. Fires burned in pits dug near the hull, heating iron tools and boiling the pitch, and the constant percussion of mallets driving wooden pins home would have filled the air from dawn until the light failed, a sound that must have become, to those who lived near the yards, as familiar and unremarkable as the tide itself. Raising a single hull of this scale by hand, without the aid of any machine beyond block and tackle and human muscle, was the work of many months, sometimes years, and it required an entire supporting economy of rope makers, pitch boilers, blacksmiths, and haulers, whose labor rarely appears in any surviving account, but without which no keel could ever have been floated. It is worth remembering, as the story now turns towards the men who would command these ships and the empire whose fate they would carry into battle, that the vessels themselves were never simply symbols of royal ambition, however much they may have served that purpose in the minds of the queen and the general who commissioned them. They were, first and always, the product of a chain of human labor, stretching from the cedar forests of Lebanon to the sawdust-covered floors of the Alexandrian yards. A chain made of nameless woodcutters, sailors, carpenters, and shipwrights whose skill, patience, and unglamorous daily toil made possible the floating giants that ancient historians would one day describe, with a mixture of wonder and disbelief, as among the largest warships the Mediterranean world had ever seen. To understand what these ships actually were, one must set aside the image of a warship as it is understood in later ages, and imagine instead something closer to a fortress that had learned, however reluctantly, to float. A great polyreme of this era, a 6, a 7, perhaps larger still, if the higher numbers recorded by ancient writers are to be trusted even in part, was not a single hull moving swiftly across open water. It was a slow, deliberate, almost geological presence, rising deck upon deck above the waterline, its silhouette closer to a walled structure than to the lean shapes of the smaller ships that would dart around it in battle like gulls around a whale. The hull itself began the story, and it began with weight. Where a triremes frame had been light, flexible, built for speed and for the quick, darting maneuvers that had won battles for the Greeks centuries before, the great ships built for Cleopatra and for Antony were constructed along entirely different principles. Their timbers were thicker, doubled in places, reinforced along the waterline with additional planking, bound tightly to the frame beneath. Some accounts suggest the hulls were strengthened further still, with layers of lead sheathing, or with heavy bronze fittings at the points most likely to bear the shock of collision. This was not shipbuilding in pursuit of grace. It was shipbuilding in pursuit of endurance, a hull meant to absorb blows rather than avoid them, to outlast an enemy rather than outrun one. Above the waterline, the rowing arrangement rose in banks, though precisely how those banks were organized remains one of the enduring puzzles of ancient naval architecture. The old assumption that a 6 or a 7 meant 6 or 7 literal rows of oars stacked one above another grew increasingly difficult to sustain as the numbers climbed. For the physical geometry of a hull tall enough to house 8 or 9 or 10 vertical rows of oarsmen becomes, at a certain point, almost impossible to reconcile with a vessel that could still float, still turn, still survive open water. The more probable explanation, favored by many who have studied the surviving fragments of ancient testimony, is that the numbers referred not to vertical banks, but to the men assigned to each oar. 2 men pulling together at one level, 3 at another. The oars themselves growing longer and heavier as the hull grew larger, until a single oar might require 4 or 5 men working in exact practiced unison simply to complete one stroke. If this is closer to the truth, then the great ships built along the Nile were, in effect, powered not by height, but by sheer accumulated human muscle. Dozens upon dozens of oarsmen packed into a hull built wide and deep enough to hold them, each man contributing a fraction of the force needed to move a structure that might displace, by some estimates, several times the tonnage of the largest trireme ever built. The labor this required can scarcely be overstated. To row such a ship was not to perform the quick, controlled bursts of effort that smaller crews might manage. It was to engage in something closer to continuous, grinding toil, hour after hour. The rhythm kept by a caller whose voice or drumbeat had to carry the length of a hull that might stretch far longer than anything the Mediterranean had seen afloat before. A single missed stroke by one bank of oarsmen could send a ripple of disorder through the whole laboring mass. And so training such a crew was not merely a matter of building strength, but of building unity. Hundreds of men learning, over weeks and months, to move as though they shared a single set of limbs. Above the oar decks, the ship became something else again, no longer simply a vessel for movement, but a platform for violence. At the bow, where the hull narrowed and thickened, a bronze ram extended forward beneath the waterline, cast heavy and blunt, designed to shatter the ribs of an enemy hull on impact. This was the ancient warship's oldest weapon, inherited from centuries of Greek and Phoenician practice. But on a ship of this size, the ram became something closer to a battering weapon wielded by an entire moving fortress rather than a single sharp thrust delivered by a nimble hull. The mass behind it meant that even a glancing collision might prove fatal to a smaller ship, and this fact alone reshaped the tactical thinking of every commander who had to plan around these giants. But it was above the waterline that the ships most clearly declared their purpose. Rising from the deck, often near the bow and stern, stood wooden towers. Boarding platforms built high enough to grant archers, javelin throwers, and stone-slinging engines a commanding view down onto the decks of any smaller ship that came near. These towers turned the vessel into something closer to a siege engine than a traditional warship. A floating wall from which missiles could be rained down onto enemies who found themselves, quite literally, looking upward at their opponents, even in the middle of open water. Some historians describe catapults mounted on these decks, capable of hurling stones or flaming projectiles across considerable distances, while others note the presence of simpler but no less effective weapons. Heavy darts, iron-tipped bolts, and the ordinary but devastating tools of ancient siege warfare repurposed now for use at sea. The deck space required to support all of this was considerable, and it was here that the true philosophy behind these ships revealed itself most plainly. A great polyreme was not built to carry a small, efficient crew of sailors and a handful of fighting men, as the older, leaner warships had been. It was built to carry an army, marines in their dozens, sometimes said to number in the hundreds aboard the very largest vessels, stood ready along the rails and towers, armed for close combat should an enemy ship draw near enough for boarding. Archers took positions where they could fire down onto approaching vessels. Engineers tended the mounted engines, adjusting range and reloading with the same grim patience that siege crews on land might have shown before the walls of a besieged city. The ship, in this sense, was less a single weapon than a coordinated system of weapons, layered one atop another, each dependent on the platform beneath it to remain steady enough to be used at all. And yet, for all this grim function, the great ships were not built without regard for how they appeared to those who watched them pass. Ancient writers, describing similar vessels of the age, dwell almost as often on ornament as on armament. Gilded prows catching the sun, painted eyes staring out from the bow in the old tradition that gave a ship something like a living face. Banners and pennants trailing from the towers, sometimes purple, sometimes gold. Colours chosen deliberately to declare the wealth and authority of whoever had commissioned the vessel. A queen's fleet, sailing beside the ships of a Roman general who had bound his fortunes to her cause, was not simply a collection of weapons. It was a floating proclamation, meant to be seen and understood from a great distance. A message written in timber, bronze, and paint, addressed as much to the world watching from the shore as to any enemy fleet that might one day meet it in battle. It is in this tension, between the ship as weapon and the ship as symbol, that something of the era's deeper character comes into view. Grandeur and practicality did not always agree with one another, and the great polyremes stood at the uneasy point where the two philosophies met and occasionally clashed. Size brought power. A hull this large could carry more men, more weapons, more raw destructive potential than anything a smaller navy might send against it. But size also brought vulnerability, in ways that would only become fully apparent once these ships were tested against faster, more maneuverable rivals. A giant is slow to turn. A giant is difficult to reposition once committed to a course. A giant, surrounded by smaller and more agile vessels working together, might find its very size becoming a liability rather than an advantage. A target too large to miss, too cumbersome to escape, too heavy to disengage once battle had been joined. None of this was lost on the men who built these ships, nor on the commanders who would one day have to decide how to use them. But in the years before that test arrived, in the shipyards along the Nile and the harbours of the eastern Mediterranean, the giants remained what they had always been intended to be, monuments to ambition as much as instruments of war, floating declarations that here, in this fleet, under this queen and this general, the old world's grandest traditions of naval power had found their fullest and perhaps their final expression. While the shipwrights of Egypt laboured to raise their monuments upon the water, a different kind of preparation was underway across the sea, in the harbours of Italy, where a younger man was arriving at conclusions of his own. His name was Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, and though history would remember him as one of the great admirals of antiquity, in these years he was still, in many respects, an experiment, a friend of Octavian's youth, risen not through noble birth but through competence and loyalty, given command of fleets because no one else had proven better suited to the task. He had already tested himself against the sea once, in the long and costly campaign against Sextus Pompeius, whose galleys had haunted the waters off Sicily, and whose defeat had taken years longer than anyone in Rome had wished. That war had taught Agrippa something the shipwrights of Alexandria did not yet seem to have learned, or perhaps had learned and chosen to set aside. That a fleet's greatness was not measured only in the size of its ships, but in how well those ships could be made to do what their commander required of them. In the moment that mattered, against an enemy who might not fight in the manner expected, Agrippa did not share the philosophy that had produced Cleopatra's giants. Where the shipwrights of Egypt had built upward and outward, adding decks and oars and the weight of siege engines until their vessels resembled floating fortresses, Agrippa looked towards something smaller, leaner, and in his estimation, far more dangerous. He had studied the great ships, or at least had heard enough of their reputation to understand what they represented, and his response was not to attempt to match them tonnage for tonnage. Rome did not have the forests of Lebanon at its immediate disposal, nor the decades of accumulated naval tradition that had produced the Hellenistic polyremes. And even had it possessed both, Agrippa was not persuaded that bigger was, in every circumstance, better. He had seen what happened to large, unwieldy vessels in narrow waters and contested currents. He had seen crews struggle to coordinate hundreds of oarsmen across multiple decks, had seen the delay between a commander's order and a ship's response stretch into something dangerous when speed was needed. A giant, he reasoned, was a magnificent thing to look upon in harbour. In the chaos of battle, its very magnificence might become its burden. So Agrippa built differently. His preference, and the preference he impressed upon the shipyards of Italy in the years leading toward the reckoning everyone now sensed was coming, was for galleys of moderate size, 4s and 5s, Liburnians and triremes, vessels that could be rowed hard and turned quickly, that carried enough men to fight, but not so many that the ship itself became a lumbering target. These were not humble vessels. A Roman quinquereme of this period was still a formidable warship, broad-beamed and sturdy, capable of ramming and of carrying marines for boarding actions, but set beside the towering polyremes said to be gathering in Egyptian waters. Agrippa's ships would have seemed almost modest, built for a different purpose entirely. He was not interested in over-awing an enemy with scale. He was interested in outmaneuvering one. This philosophy extended into the shipyards themselves, where Roman practices of construction had long favored a certain practicality over ornament. The great naval bases at Misenum and Ravenna, both established or expanded under Agrippa's direction in these years, were built for production and readiness rather than spectacle. Timber was drawn from the forests of Italy and beyond, seasoned and shaped according to methods that had been refined across generations of Roman shipbuilding, methods that emphasized speed of construction and reliability of performance over the elaborate specialization that had gone into the great Hellenistic flagships. Rome did not need to invent a new class of vessel to answer the giants of the East. It needed enough well-built, well-crewed ships of proven design and the discipline to use them well. Yet Agrippa was not a man to rely on doctrine alone, and among the innovations attributed to him in these years was a device that would become, in its way, as significant to the coming battle as any hull design. Ancient sources describe a mechanism the Romans called the harpax, a grappling engine that could be fired or launched from a ship's deck to seize an enemy vessel at a distance and draw it close, allowing marines to board before the enemy could pull away or bring its greater bulk to bear. The device echoed, in spirit if not in exact mechanism, an older Roman invention from the wars against Carthage, the corvus, that hinged boarding ramp, which had once allowed Roman soldiers to turn naval battles into something closer to land combat, closing with an enemy ship and fighting hand-to-hand rather than relying on the more specialized maneuvers of ramming and evasion that Greek and Egyptian navies had long favored. The harpax, whatever its precise form, and the sources that describe it are not entirely consistent on this point, represented the same underlying instinct, If the enemy possessed ships too large and too well armored to be sunk by ramming alone, then the answer was to close the distance, to seize hold of them, and to let Roman soldiers decide the matter with sword and shield, the manner of fighting in which Rome had always excelled. This was the strategic philosophy taking shape in the years before Actium, though it would not be fully revealed until the battle itself. Speed and coordination set against brute size and firepower, mobility against mass, the trained response of many small crews against the slow, deliberate power of a few enormous ones. It was not yet clear, even to the men shaping it, whether this philosophy would prevail. History offered no shortage of examples in either direction. There were battles in which nimble ships had darted around larger vessels and picked them apart at the edges, exploiting a giant's inability to turn quickly or to defend every quarter at once. There were other battles in which sheer size and the weight of missile fire had crushed smaller opposition before it could ever close the distance needed to make maneuverability matter. Agrippa could not have known with certainty which pattern would repeat itself on the waters off Greece. What he could do was prepare as thoroughly as the years allowed, and this he did with a method that would become, in the retelling by later historians, almost a signature of his character. The training of Roman crews in these years was methodical, in a way that matched Agrippa's own temperament. At Lake Avernus, connected by a channel to the sea and sheltered from any observation by potential enemies, Agrippa established what amounted to a training ground, a body of water where new crews could be drilled in the arts of rowing, ramming, and coordinated maneuver away from the dangers and distractions of the open Mediterranean. Oarsmen who had never before pulled a naval oar were brought in by the thousands, many of them freedmen and provincials rather than the aristocratic marines who filled the fighting decks, and they were drilled relentlessly until the coordination required to move a warship as a single responsive instrument became, if not natural, at least reliable under pressure. This was not glamorous work, and the sources that describe it do so with the same measured tone Agrippa himself seems to have brought to the task. A recognition that a fleet is only as good as the men who row it, and the discipline that binds their 1,000 individual motions into one. The preparation extended beyond the oarsmen to the officers who would command individual ships, and the coordination between vessels that would allow a fleet, rather than a collection of isolated ships, to fight as a whole. Agrippa understood, perhaps better than his eventual opponents, that a battle at sea was won as much through the ability of separate crews to respond to a single unified strategy as through the courage or skill of any single vessel. Where the Egyptian and Antonian fleet, drawing on the polyglot traditions of the Eastern Mediterranean, might rely on the individual reputation and capability of its magnificent flagships, Agrippa was building something more uniform, more interchangeable, a fleet in which the loss of any single ship, however capable, would not unravel the whole. It was, in its way, a very Roman approach to warfare, echoing the legion's own philosophy of standardized, replaceable strength over the singular brilliance of the champion or the hero. None of this preparation guaranteed an outcome. The two philosophies now taking shape on opposite shores of the Mediterranean, the towering, ornamented power of Cleopatra's polyremes and the lean, coordinated speed of Agrippa's galleys, represented genuinely different wagers about the nature of naval war, and neither side could be certain, in these years of quiet preparation, which wager would prove sound. What both sides shared, whatever their differences in method, was the understanding that the ships now being built and drilled were not merely tools of war, but expressions of everything their builders believed about how war ought to be fought, and by extension, about the kind of world that ought to follow whichever side prevailed. The roads to Actium were being laid not only across the geography of the Mediterranean, in the movements of soldiers and the gathering of supplies, but in the timber yards of Italy and the training waters of Lake Avernus, in the slow, patient accumulation of skill and design that would, in time, be tested against the sea's own indifferent judgment. In the years that followed those first exchanges of design and philosophy, the movement of armies and fleets across the eastern Mediterranean took on the slow, deliberate character of two great bodies drawing breath before a final effort. There was no single morning when the world woke to war. Instead, there was a gathering, a thickening of forces along coastlines and in harbours, a redistribution of men and grain and timber that anyone watching closely could read as clearly as a sentence written in a foreign but familiar script. Antony, with the resources of the eastern provinces and the wealth of Egypt behind him, drew his forces westward into Greece, a land that had served empires before his as both battlefield and threshold. Octavian, from Italy, made his own preparations with the patience of a man who understood that haste in matters of this scale was often indistinguishable from ruin. Antony's choice of the Ambracian Gulf as the seat of his fleet and army was not made carelessly. The Gulf offered a narrow mouth opening onto the Ionian Sea, guarded by promontories on either side, and within that mouth, a broad sheltered basin capable of holding a great number of ships at anchor, safe from the worst of the open water's temper. On the southern promontory stood the small town of Actium, from which the strait, the coming battle, and in time, the very age itself would take their name. The waters here were treacherous in their own quiet way, not stormy so much as narrow, prone to shifting currents where gulf met sea, a place where a fleet might find itself pressed between the safety of the anchorage and the uncertainty of the strait beyond. Cleopatra's ships, along with Antony's, filled the Gulf through the early months of preparation. Their masts said by those who saw them to have stood so thick along the shore that the anchorage itself seemed to have grown a second shoreline of timber and rope. It was, in the calculus of the time, a reasonable place to make a stand. The Gulf could be defended by land as well as sea, its narrow entrance a natural choke point against a numerically superior enemy, and the surrounding country offered forage and water enough, at least for a time, to sustain the tens of thousands of men now encamped along its shores. But a fortress of water, however well chosen, carries within its design the seed of a particular vulnerability. What can be defended by narrowness can also be sealed by it. This was the lesson that Agrippa, with his customary economy of motion, set about teaching in the months that followed. Agrippa did not come to Greece seeking an immediate confrontation. He came instead as a man intent on strangulation, understanding that a fleet as heavy and as thirsty for provision as Antony's could be defeated as thoroughly by hunger as by ramming and fire. Through the spring and summer, Octavian's forces, with Agrippa directing the naval element, moved to occupy the harbours and islands that lay along the routes by which grain, water, and reinforcement might reach the Gulf. Corcyra was taken, Methone fell, and with it, a portion of Antony's supply chain from Egypt was severed at a stroke. Patrae and Corinth, one by one, came under the shadow of Octavian's ships, until the sea lanes that had once carried the wealth of the East toward Antony's anchorage narrowed, then narrowed again, until only the most hazardous and least certain routes remained open to him. It was a blockade built not of a single dramatic act, but of many small closures, each one unremarkable in isolation, each one narrowing the margin by which Antony's great fleet might continue to feed and sustain itself. Agrippa understood, as perhaps only a commander steeped in Rome's own harsh mathematics of siege and supply could understand, that a fleet of giants is also a fleet of enormous appetites. The very size that made Antony's ships formidable in battle made them costly to maintain in stillness, and stillness, as the weeks accumulated into months, was precisely what the Gulf's geography and Agrippa's patient encirclement conspired to impose. The consequences of this slow strangulation showed themselves first, not in the grand movements of fleets, but in the smaller, more human accountings that chroniclers of the time recorded with a kind of weary precision. Disease moved through the camps along the Gulf's marshy edges with the particular cruelty reserved for large gatherings of men confined too long in one place. The marshes of Ambracia, fertile and green in appearance, bred the fevers that spread among the rowers and soldiers alike, weakening crews already strained by reduced rations. Ancient sources speak of sickness thinning the ranks of oarsmen through that summer, of men who had once been counted among the fleet's greatest strength. For a galley, whatever its size, is only as swift and only as capable as the men who pull its oars, falling instead to fevers that no admiral's strategy could outmaneuver. Desertion, too, crept into the story of those months, quiet and corrosive. Some among Antony's officers and allied kings, watching the tightening of Octavian's grip and weighing the diminishing likelihood of relief, chose to slip away rather than commit themselves to a struggle, whose outcome seemed, with each passing week, less certain. Among these were men of standing, client kings and commanders whose departure carried weight beyond their individual absence, for it signaled to those who remained that confidence in the eventual outcome was no longer universal, even within the camp. The historian who later recorded these events noted the departures with the calm remove of one recounting the slow leak of water from a vessel already listing. Each loss small, none individually decisive, all of them together a portrait of a cause losing its cohesion. Provisions, meanwhile, dwindled in the manner that provisions always do when supply is cut faster than consumption can be reduced. Grain grew scarce. Water, too, became a concern as the summer advanced, and the marshy inlets that fed the Gulf offered less that was fit to drink. The great ships, whose size had been designed to overawe an enemy and to carry the machinery of war across open water, now sat largely idle in the Gulf's calm anchorage, their crews diminished by fever and flight, their stores measured with an anxious frugality that had not been anticipated when the keels were first laid in the yards of the East. It was against this backdrop of tightening circumstance that the debate among Antony's commanders took shape, a debate the sources describe with more nuance than the later legend of the battle would allow. Some among his officers, and notably the veteran commander Canidius Crassus, who had led Antony's land forces through long campaigns in the East, argued for abandoning the fleet altogether, or at least reducing it, and withdrawing the army by land into Macedonia and Thrace, where Antony's veteran legions might still find advantage in familiar terrain, and where the crippling cost of maintaining so vast a fleet in a hostile blockade could be set aside. It was, by this reasoning, a soldier's argument, grounded in the plain arithmetic of supply and morale, and it carried the weight of long experience. Cleopatra, whose resources had built much of the fleet and whose kingdom's survival was bound inseparably to the outcome of the campaign, is recorded by ancient sources as having argued for the opposite course, for a resolution at sea, where her ships, however diminished by disease and desertion, still retained speed and maneuverability that might be turned to advantage, and where a victory, however narrow, could preserve both the fleet and the political alliance upon which Antony's eastern power rested. It is worth noting, with the caution that the surviving accounts were written largely by the victors and their sympathizers, that the full truth of this debate, who argued what and with what sincerity, is not something later ages can recover with certainty. What can be said with more confidence is that a genuine strategic disagreement existed, that the choice between a stand at sea and a retreat by land was neither simple nor obvious to those who lived through it, and that the decision eventually made, to commit the fleet to a breakout by water rather than abandon it, was not made in ignorance of the alternative, but as a considered wager against considerable odds. The tension in the Gulf through those final weeks before the battle, built not through any single dramatic turn, but through this steady accumulation of strategic pressure. The blockade drawing tighter, the sickness spreading through the camps, the desertions multiplying in small but telling numbers, the debates among the commanders growing more urgent even as they remained, by all report, measured in their tone. It was the tension of a vessel groaning under a slowly increasing weight rather than the shock of a sudden storm. A pressure that mounted quietly, day by day, until the only question remaining was not whether a reckoning would come, but by what method it would finally arrive. In the weeks before that reckoning arrived, life aboard the great ships continued in its own slow rhythm, largely unrecorded by the historians who would later write of trumpets and burning decks, but no less real for its absence from the grander narrative. Somewhere beneath the account of strategy and blockade, tens of thousands of men rose each morning to the particular labor of simply keeping a fleet of giants afloat and functioning. And it is worth pausing here, before the battle itself, to consider what that labor actually asked of them. The oarsmen bore the heaviest weight of this daily existence, though weight is perhaps the wrong word for men whose work was measured less in pounds than in hours, in the endless repetition of a single motion drawn out across a watch, then a day, then a week. On the largest of Antony's ships, the ones built with 3, 4, even 5 men to an oar, the labor was not one of raw individual strength, so much as of terrible, sustained coordination. A single oarsman pulling out of rhythm or faltering from exhaustion could throw off the stroke of an entire bank. And so the work demanded not only endurance, but a kind of grim attentiveness that never fully relaxed, even in the calm of a sheltered anchorage. The sources that survive say little of these men directly. Ancient historians rarely troubled themselves with the experience of the rowing benches. But from what is known of galley life in general, and from the sheer physical demands the larger hulls must have placed on their crews, historians have reconstructed a picture of blistered palms wrapped in cloth, of backs and shoulders aching long before a single oar met open water in anger, of men sleeping where they could between shifts rather than where they might have chosen to. Above and around the oarsmen, in the tighter spaces allotted to fighting men, the Marines endured a different kind of discomfort. These were soldiers first, many of them, trained to the discipline of formation and blade, rather than to the particular claustrophobia of shipboard life. And the quarters given to them aboard, even the largest vessels, were cramped by any standard, let alone the standard of a man used to a legionary's tent and the relative freedom of a marching camp. Bedding down among coils of rope, stacks of javelins, and the ever-present smell of bodies packed close together in the heat of a Mediterranean summer, the Marines occupied a strange middle position, essential to the ship's purpose, yet somewhat foreign to its rhythms, waiting through long stretches of idleness for a fight that would demand from them a very different kind of skill than the endless labor asked of the men below. Food and water, meanwhile, fell under the careful and increasingly anxious management of the fleet's officers, for a ship the size of Antony's great galleys did not simply carry men. It carried the enormous daily burden of feeding and hydrating them, in a season and a region where both had grown steadily scarcer as the blockade tightened. Ancient accounts describe rationing that grew more careful, more calculated, as the weeks wore on. The officers weighing out grain and measuring water with the particular seriousness of men who understood that a fleet could be defeated by thirst as easily as by an enemy's ram. Historians have noted that this quiet arithmetic of mouths to feed against stores diminishing may have shaped the eventual decisions at Actium as much as any tactical consideration, though the ancient sources, more interested in the drama of battle than the tedium of supply, offer only glimpses of this pressure rather than a full accounting of it. It is worth remembering, too, that not every man aboard these ships had chosen the sea as his element. Among Antony's forces were soldiers whose experience and inclination lay firmly with land warfare. men who had marched through Gaul or the eastern provinces, who understood the discipline of the infantry square far better than the pitch and roll of a hull beneath open sky. For these men, the great ships must have presented a peculiar unease, an unfamiliarity that no amount of training could entirely dissolve. The constant motion of a vessel at anchor, subtle as it often was, nonetheless offered a persistent reminder that the ground beneath one's feet was not, in fact, ground at all. Ancient writers occasionally allude to this discomfort among Antony's forces, some later commentators suggesting that a portion of his infantry felt distinctly out of their element aboard ship, more suited to a fight on solid earth than to the strange, floating architecture of the fleet. Whether this unease meaningfully affected performance in the battle to come remains a matter historians continue to debate, but its presence in the weeks of waiting seems, on balance, likely. A quiet current of apprehension running beneath the more visible business of drills and repairs and rationing. Amid all this, one presence aboard the fleet drew particular attention from ancient writers and continues to draw it from historians today, that of Cleopatra herself. It was, by any measure, an unusual role for a monarch to occupy, not directing affairs from a palace or a fortified camp inland, but present with the fleet itself aboard her own flagship, in a position that placed her, at least in some accounts, closer to the machinery of war than most rulers of her era, male or female, ever chose to stand. The ancient sources that describe her presence do so with varying degrees of detail and varying degrees of reliability, colored as many of them are by the political interests of a later Roman narrative, eager to cast her as a foreign and destabilizing influence upon Antony's judgment. With that necessary hedge in mind, it remains a matter of record, attested across multiple ancient accounts, that Cleopatra did travel with the fleet, that she brought with her a portion of the Egyptian treasury, and that her ships and her presence were treated by contemporaries as a significant, if controversial, feature of the campaign. Some later writers would claim that her flight from the battle, when it came, precipitated Antony's own withdrawal, a claim historians now treat with considerable skepticism, given how conveniently it served Roman propaganda to place the blame for a Roman general's defeat upon a foreign queen. What can be said with more confidence is simply this: a monarch was present with her fleet in the days before Actium, in a manner that ancient observers found notable enough to record, and that modern historians still find worth examining, if only for what it reveals about the unusual coalition Antony had assembled, and the equally unusual position Cleopatra occupied within it. Beyond the great questions of strategy and command, the fleet at anchor in those weeks offered its own quieter sensory world, one that no ancient chronicler thought to preserve in detail, but which can be gently reconstructed from what is known of galley life across the ancient Mediterranean. There would have been the constant creak of timber, a sound so persistent that men likely ceased to notice it after the first days, the great hulls shifting almost imperceptibly against their anchor lines, working gently at the water even at rest. There would have been the smell of pitch, thick and resinous, mingled with salt air and the closer, more human smells of a crowded ship, sweat and boiled grain, and the sharper tang of oil used to protect metal and leather against the damp. At night, the fleet would have settled into a different rhythm, lanterns swaying gently along the rails, the murmur of watches changing, the distant sound of waves against hulls that never entirely fell silent. It was, in its way, a small floating world unto itself. Thousands of men and dozens of ships bound together by routine and necessity, waiting through the slow accumulation of days for a resolution that none of them could yet foresee with any certainty. This human interlude, largely invisible in the grander accounts that would later be written of Actium's strategy and its outcome, deserves its own quiet place in the story, before the trumpets and the burning oil, Before the maneuvers that would decide the fate of an empire, there was simply this: the daily labor of rowing, the careful weighing of grain, the uneasy sleep of soldiers unaccustomed to the sea, and a queen aboard her own ship, present in a role few of her predecessors had ever occupied, watching the same slow tide that watched every other soul afloat in that crowded gulf. It is a world easy to overlook, folded as it is beneath the weight of what followed. But it was in this world, among these small and largely undocumented human details, that the great ships of Actium spent their final ordinary days before the sea around them changed forever. In the days before the battle, if one could have stood on the high ground above the Ambracian Gulf and looked down upon the water, the sight would have told a story that no speech from either commander could have told half so plainly. Two fleets lay at anchor within reach of one another, and though both called themselves Roman in some fashion, though both flew standards descended from the same republic and the same wars, they did not resemble each other at all. It was not simply a matter of numbers, though the numbers mattered. It was a matter of philosophy, carried into wood and rope and oar, so that a person walking the shoreline that summer, passing from one anchorage to the other, would have felt the difference before they understood it. The difference between a fleet built to endure and a fleet built to move. Antony and Cleopatra's ships rode low and heavy in the Gulf, their hulls broad, their upper works crowded with the machinery of a static kind of war. These were, by the account of the sources that survive, the descendants of the great polyremes that had dominated the eastern Mediterranean since the days of the successor kings. Quinqueremes and larger vessels still, some said 6s and 7s, even a scattering of ships larger yet, floating fortresses armoured along their bows with plates of bronze, their decks raised into towers from which archers and light artillery could sweep an approaching enemy. They were, in the most literal sense, ships built to be shot from and boarded onto, floating extensions of the siege lines that had defined warfare in the Hellenistic world for 3 centuries. A soldier standing on one of these decks might reasonably have felt that he stood on solid ground. So thick was the timber beneath him, so numerous were the men crowded along the rails. Marines by the hundreds on the larger vessels, according to the ancient tallies, far outnumbering the oarsmen who powered them. This was a fleet designed to receive an attack and grind it to nothing, to let an enemy break itself against a wall of wood and bronze, and then, at the chosen moment, to answer with the terrible weight of numbers packed onto every deck. Octavian and Agrippa's ships were of an entirely different character, and it is here that the record, however incomplete, becomes almost unanimous in its emphasis. Where Antony's fleet leaned toward the massive, Agrippa had spent the preceding years assembling something leaner, Liburnians and smaller triremes, quick and shallow-drafted, built not to absorb blows, but to avoid them, to dart in and out of range, to encircle rather than confront. These were the ships of a commander who had learned, in earlier campaigns against Sextus Pompey's fleets in the waters off Sicily, that speed and coordination could undo raw size, that a swarm of smaller vessels working in concert could isolate and destroy a giant far more efficiently than any single ship of equal size could hope to fight one. Agrippa had reportedly experimented with new grappling devices, with reinforced rams, with tactics of feint and withdrawal that depended entirely on a ship's ability to turn faster than its opponent, to slip away before the enemy's marines could close the gap and swarm aboard. His fleet was not weak. The sources make clear that these were serious warships, well-built and well-crewed, not the light skiffs the word smaller might suggest to a modern ear. But it was built on an entirely different wager. It gambled on mobility over mass, on coordination over individual strength, on fire and encirclement rather than the brute press of boarding parties. The ancient historians who tried to set these fleets down in numbers did so with a confidence that later scholarship has learned to treat carefully. Plutarch, writing more than a century after the battle, offers figures for both sides that have shaped nearly every account since. Several hundred ships on Antony's side, considerably fewer according to some tallies, though the numbers shift depending on which portion of the fleet one includes, and whether transport vessels and supply ships are counted alongside warships proper. Cassius Dio, writing later still, gives his own figures, not always in agreement with Plutarch's, and the discrepancies between the two are not small enough to dismiss. Modern historians, working through what remains of both accounts alongside the physical evidence recovered from the site of the Victory Monument Octavian later built above the Gulf, have generally concluded that Antony's fleet, while including undeniably larger ships, was likely smaller in overall number than Octavian's. A reversal of the popular image, in which the underdog is imagined as facing an overwhelming and superior force. The imbalance, if it existed as such, ran in numbers of hulls rather than in numbers of men, and the numbers themselves remain a matter of respectful disagreement among those who have spent careers trying to reconcile ancient rhetoric with ancient record-keeping. What can be said with more confidence is simply this: the fleets differed sharply in composition, and that difference was the entire point. Antony's forces, whatever their precise count, concentrated strength into fewer, larger platforms. Octavian's, whatever their precise count, distributed it across a greater number of faster ones. Neither side entered the Gulf that summer, with numbers alone as the deciding question. Both understood, in their own way, that the shape of a fleet mattered as much as its size. There is a temptation, looking back across 2,000 years, to see in this contrast something larger than a tactical decision made by two admirals in a single campaign. To see in it the outline of two different futures for the Mediterranean world. Two different answers to the question of how power ought to be organized and projected across water. Antony and Cleopatra's fleet, in its scale and its ornament, in its towering decks and its heavy bronze-clad prows, echoed the old world of the Hellenistic kingdoms. The world in which a ruler's authority was made visible in monuments of overwhelming size. A fleet, in some sense, that was still fighting the wars of Demetrius and the successors, still measuring greatness in tonnage and grandeur. Octavian and Agrippa's fleet, lighter, faster, built around coordination rather than singular might, seemed to gesture towards something else, though neither man could have named it in those terms at the time. A world in which power would be organized not through spectacle, but through system, not through the individual magnificence of a single vessel, but through the disciplined management of many smaller parts working as one. It would be too neat and too unfair to the men who actually made these decisions under the pressures of an active campaign, to claim that either commander set out to embody a philosophy of empire. Antony had inherited much of his fleet from the naval traditions of the Ptolemaic and successor kingdoms, because those traditions were what the Eastern Mediterranean offered him, and because size had served the successors well enough in their own generation of wars. Agrippa had built his fleet the way he did, because he had watched larger, clumsier ships struggle against smaller and faster ones in Sicilian waters, and had drawn the obvious lesson. Neither man was writing a treatise on the future of Rome, and yet, whatever their intentions, the result was a confrontation that later generations, Roman and modern alike, would come to read as exactly that. A meeting not merely of two commanders and two fleets, but of two visions for what dominance over the sea, and by extension over the world the sea connected, ought to look like. It is worth pausing on this in the last quiet days before the story moves to open water, because the battle that followed would be remembered less for its tactical details, which remain frustratingly obscure even now, than for what it seemed to settle. The great galleys anchored in the Ambracian Gulf that summer were, whatever their numbers, the physical argument for one kind of Mediterranean future. a world still governed by the logic of Alexander's successors, in which the Eastern kingdoms and their queen might yet hold their place against the rising power of the West. The lighter ships arrayed against them were the physical argument for another, a Mediterranean unified and administered from a single center, under a single family, its power built not on any one overwhelming symbol, but on the coordinated strength of many ordinary things working with discipline toward a common end. Neither fleet knew in those final days which argument the sea would uphold. The soldiers crowded onto Antony's high decks, trained for boarding actions and accustomed to fighting on something resembling solid ground, had no way of knowing that mobility would matter more than mass in the days to come. The oarsmen and marines aboard Agrippa's swift Liburnians had no way of knowing either whether their commander's wager on speed would survive contact with ships several times their size. All that either side could do, in the last calm mornings before the fleets moved, was what sailors and soldiers have always done before a battle, whose outcome no one can foresee. Check the rigging, sharpen the blades, watch the water, and wait for the wind to decide what the historians would later insist had been decided by genius all along. The second day of September arrived quietly, as most mornings on the Ambracian Gulf did that late summer, with a haze lying low over the water and the hills of Actium rising pale and indistinct behind it. The sea, when the light finally reached it, was calm, the kind of calm that sailors on both sides would have noted with private relief. For a rough sea would have favored the smaller, nimbler ships of Agrippa's fleet, and a dead calm gave Antony's giants at least the illusion of stability. There was little wind, and what wind there was moved fitfully, unable to decide its own direction, as though the day itself were as uncertain as the men who waited on it. According to the accounts that survive, it was this stillness, more than any signal or trumpet, that told the fleets the waiting was over. Ships do not move quickly under sail without wind, and so what began that morning began slowly, oars dipping into water that barely rippled, hulls easing forward with the unhurried patience that ancient naval warfare demanded even at its most decisive hour. Antony's fleet emerged from the Gulf in a manner that reflected weeks of deliberation rather than sudden decision. The great galleys came out first, or so the surviving accounts suggest, their bronze-sheathed rams catching what light there was, their high wooden sides making them look, from a distance, less like ships than like fortresses that had somehow slipped their foundations and gone to sea. They formed a line, broad, deliberate, and defensive in character, the ships spaced to allow no easy gap for a smaller vessel to slip through and strike from an unexpected angle. Cleopatra's squadron, by most reconstructions, held a position toward the rear of this formation, 60 ships bearing the treasury that had financed so much of the campaign, waiting with the particular tension of those who carry the means of survival rather than the instruments of the fight itself. The line stretched across a considerable breadth of water, and observers on the shore, for there were observers on the shore, soldiers and camp followers of both armies who had climbed the low hills for a view they could describe to no one who would believe them fully, must have found the sight almost impossible to take in its entirety. A wall of ships moving with the ponderous care of things too large to hurry, easing out onto open water under a sky that gave no hint of what the day intended. Agrippa's fleet, watching this emergence from a distance, did not rush to close the gap. The Liburnians and Quinqueremes under his command arranged themselves with a different kind of purpose, spreading wide rather than forming a single dense line, probing the edges of Antony's formation rather than advancing directly upon its center. This was not hesitation. It was, if the later historians are to be trusted in their reconstruction of the tactics involved, a considered refusal to give Antony's larger ships the close, static engagement in which their size and their marines would matter most. Agrippa's ships moved and turned and repositioned, testing distances, watching for any break in the enemy line that might open under the strain of holding formation for hours on water that offered no wind to fill a sail and steady a course. The two fleets, seen together from the hills above, must have resembled less a battle than a slow and wary negotiation conducted in the language of position and distance, each side declining to make the first commitment that could not be undone. The hours that followed have been described by every ancient source that survives, and each source agrees, whatever their disagreements on numbers and outcomes elsewhere, that the waiting was long. The sun climbed and the haze burned away, and still the ships held their distances, adjusting by small degrees, oarsmen resting on their benches in shifts, while officers watched the enemy line for any sign of intention. This is a detail worth sitting with, because it says something true about naval warfare in this era that the drama of later retellings tends to obscure. Battles at sea in the ancient world were not decided in a sudden clash of onset, as land battles sometimes were, but built slowly out of maneuver, out of the patient search for an advantage that might present itself only after hours of careful positioning. The men aboard those ships, thousands of them, oarsmen below the decks and marines above, cooks and physicians and slaves pressed into service, boys barely old enough to hold a weapon, standing beside veterans who had rowed and fought from Philippi to Naulochus, endured a morning that asked nothing dramatic of them at all. They held their positions, they watched the water, they waited for a decision that neither side seemed eager to make. It was Antony's fleet that had come out to fight, and yet even Antony's fleet showed a reluctance, in those early hours, to close the distance and commit to the engagement his critics had long predicted. Some ancient accounts suggest that Antony hoped Agrippa might be tempted into a rash advance against the wall of larger ships, an advance that would let the great galleys use their size and their marines to crush the smaller vessels at close range. Agrippa, for his part, seems to have understood this temptation and refused it entirely, keeping his ships at a distance that denied Antony's galleys the collision they were built for. The result was a morning of maneuver without contact, ships gliding and turning across water that remained, throughout, almost eerily calm. A stillness that must have felt to the men aboard both fleets like the held breath before a wave breaks, except that the wave, in this case, seemed unwilling to break at all. When contact did begin, it did not begin everywhere at once. The engagement opened, according to the fullest surviving accounts, at the edges of the two formations rather than at their centers, smaller actions flickering into being as individual captains found openings or were forced into them by the slow drift of the larger lines. The tools available to both sides in these first exchanges were the same tools that had decided sea battles for centuries before Actium and would continue to decide them for centuries after. The ram, driven into an enemy hull below the waterline by a ship with enough speed and mass to make the blow count, and fire, carried aboard in pots of pitch and hurled or dropped onto enemy decks in the hope that wood soaked in tar and rigging heavy with rope would catch and spread before it could be doused. Neither tool required elaboration, and the ancient sources describe their use without the graphic embellishment that a later age might have supplied. A ship rammed, took on water, and began the slow business of sinking or grounding. A ship set alight burned, sometimes quickly, sometimes with a stubbornness that let its crew fight the flames for long minutes before abandoning the effort. There is a plainness to these descriptions that feels, in its own way, more unsettling than any dramatized account could manage. The historians simply state what happened, ship by ship, without pausing to dwell on what it might have felt like to stand on a burning deck in the middle of a gulf, waiting for rescue that might never come. The Liburnians, true to the design that Agrippa had wagered on, proved difficult targets for the great galleys to catch and harder still to hold once caught. Ancient accounts describe swarms of these smaller ships circling the larger vessels, darting close enough to hurl fire or attempt to strike at an oar bank before pulling away from any countering move, forcing Antony's galleys to expend effort defending themselves against attackers who rarely stayed still long enough to be properly engaged. This was, in effect, the tactical argument that had shaped both fleets before the battle ever began, now playing out in real time on water that had gone from glassy calm to churned and smoking as the morning wore into afternoon. Whether the great galleys were as immobile as later tradition insisted, or simply outmaneuvered by superior numbers of smaller ships working in coordination, the sources do not fully agree, and the honest accounting must acknowledge that uncertainty rather than resolve it artificially in favor of a cleaner story. What can be said with more confidence is that the true weight of the battle, the moment at which the outcome of the day, and with it the outcome of the Roman world, would be settled, had not yet arrived, even as these first exchanges of fire and ram accumulated across the Gulf. The morning's maneuvering, the long hours of positioning and probing, had brought the fleets into contact at their margins, without yet forcing the central question that both commanders understood to be the day's true stakes: whether Cleopatra's treasure ships, waiting at the rear of Antony's formation with their sails still furled and ready, would find the opening they needed, or whether Agrippa's patient encirclement would close before that opening could be found. The sun stood higher now. The smoke from the first burning ships drifted low across water, still strangely calm beneath all the violence unfolding upon it, and still, for those watching from the hills and those waiting aboard the ships nearer the center of each line, the battle that would decide an empire had not yet, in its fullest sense, begun. It began, as such things often do, not with a single moment, but with a slow gathering of small collisions, each one unremarkable on its own, each one adding its weight to a scale that had not yet tipped. The right wing of Antony's fleet, where the great ships rode heaviest in the water, met Agrippa's lighter squadrons first. The giant galleys came forward with the deliberate, unhurried motion of things too large to do otherwise, their oars biting the water in long, practiced strokes, their towers crowded with marines who had waited through the whole slow morning for this. The Liburnians did not meet them head-on. They had never intended to. They came in at angles, 2 and 3 at a time, darting toward the great hulls and away again, testing the reach of the catapults, watching where the missiles fell short and where they did not. The sources that survive, thin as they are on the particulars, agree on this much. The first true violence of the day came in the crash of oars. A Liburnian, quicker and lower in the water, would drive alongside one of the towering galleys and rake its oar bank, snapping the long wooden shafts against the hull in a single grinding pass, leaving the rowers on that side suddenly useless, their strokes catching air, the great ship listing into a slow, helpless turn. It was not a killing blow. It did not need to be. A galley that cannot turn, that cannot answer the ships closing around it, becomes something else entirely. Not a weapon anymore, but a target, patient and enormous, waiting for whatever came next. What came next, in many cases, was fire. The Liburnians carried braziers and pots of pitch, and their captains had drilled, in the weeks before, at closing just near enough to fling burning material onto a deck or into rigging before pulling away again. Wet hides had been draped over the timbers of Antony's ships in the days before the battle, a defense against exactly this, and for a time it held. But wet hides dry in the sun, and fire finds gaps that no amount of preparation can fully close. Where it caught, in a coil of rope left too near a brazier, in a sail not quite lowered in time, in the pitch-soaked seams of a hull that had stood too long unmaintained, it spread with a speed that must have seemed almost contemptuous of the size of the ship it consumed. A galley that had taken a year to build and a forest to timber could be a wall of flame within the space of an afternoon. The great ships were not without their own answer, where they could bring their weight to bear directly, where a heavy galley managed to grapple a smaller vessel, or crush one beneath its bow, or bring its catapults to bear on a target that had misjudged the range. The outcome was swift and total. There are accounts, uncertain in their detail but consistent in their shape, of Liburnians shattered outright by stones flung from the towers, of Marines pouring down onto the smaller decks in numbers no light crew could withstand. The giants were not helpless, but they were increasingly encircled, and a ship encircled, however large, fights a battle it did not choose, on terms it cannot set. This was the vulnerability Agrippa had built his fleet to exploit, and by the middle of the morning it had begun to show itself with a clarity that no rhetoric beforehand could have promised. The great galleys could win any single engagement. They could not win all of them at once, on every side, for hour after hour, against ships that never had to stand and receive what they could not answer. It was somewhere in this widening, grinding contest. The ancient writers disagree on precisely when, and disagree further on precisely why. That the moment came which history would spend the following 2,000 years turning over without ever quite resolving. Cleopatra's squadron, 60 ships by the counts that have survived, had held its position at the rear of the formation since the fleets first closed, sails furled, oars shipped, waiting. And then, according to the accounts that have come down through Roman hands, they did not wait any longer. The sails came up, the ships turned, found a gap in the fighting to their south, and passed through it, out past the flank of the battle and into open water, running before a wind that had, by early afternoon, begun at last to rise from the direction the calm of the morning had promised it eventually would. What this meant, what it was intended to mean, is a question the sources cannot answer with any confidence, and it would be a disservice to the record to pretend otherwise. Roman writers, composing decades later under an emperor whose entire legitimacy rested on having defeated Antony and Cleopatra together, had every reason to shape the story toward flight and betrayal, toward a queen whose nerve broke and a general whose devotion undid him. It is the version that survived, and it is the version repeated most often since, but there is another reading, offered more cautiously by some modern historians working from the same thin evidence, that the treasure ships had been positioned at the rear from the very start with exactly this purpose. That breaking free once the battle's shape became clear was not panic but plan, an attempt to preserve the war chest and the queen herself for a fight to be continued elsewhere, on terms more favorable than a naval battle that had begun to go badly. Whether that plan had been shared with Antony in advance, or whether he learned of it only as he watched her sails catch the wind, no source can say with certainty. What can be said is only what happened next. Antony transferred himself from his own flagship to a smaller, faster vessel. The accounts agree at least on this, and followed her out through the same gap, leaving his flagship and the greater part of his fleet still engaged behind him. It is worth pausing on how strange this must have looked to the men still fighting on the decks he left behind. Their commander, in the middle of the battle that would decide the war, boarding a smaller ship and departing the field. Whether he intended, as some ancient writers suggest, to regroup his fleet from a position of greater mobility, or whether he simply could not bear to be parted from her, or whether the decision was made in the confusion of smoke and noise with less clarity than any later story would grant it. This too the record does not settle, and it does the moment no honor to pretend a certainty that does not exist. What is certain only is the shape of the consequence. The commander was gone, the Queen's ships were gone, and the great fleet that remained, still locked in its grinding contest with Agrippa's lighter ships, fought on without either of them. For a battle whose outcome, in the truest sense, had already been decided somewhere else. What followed had less of the drama of a great battle, and more the quality of a slow collapse, the kind that comes not from a single blow, but from the gradual failure of will in men who no longer knew what they were fighting to achieve. Word of the commander's departure moved through the fleet the way such things do. Not as an announcement, but as a rumor, a silence where orders should have been, a flagship that no longer answered signals. Some crews fought on regardless, and fought well. There are accounts of galleys resisting long after any hope of a coordinated victory had passed. Their marines and oarsmen holding position out of discipline or simple stubbornness, rather than any expectation of triumph. Others did not. Ships began to strike their colors. Others were abandoned outright, their crews taking to small boats or simply leaping into the water rather than remain aboard a burning hull, leaving the great vessels to drift, empty and half-consumed, among the wreckage of a fight that no longer needed them. By the time the sun began its long decline toward the hills above the Gulf, the greater part of the battle had already resolved itself. Ships still burned on the water, sending up columns of smoke that would have been visible, by every account, to the soldiers of both armies still waiting uselessly on the shores to either side. Men who had marched and camped and starved through weeks of standoff only to watch the war decided, in an afternoon they had no part in. The scale of the loss, when later observers tried to reckon it, resists easy arithmetic. Ships burned to the waterline leave little to count, and crews scattered or drowned leave fewer records still. What can be said with confidence is only the shape of the thing. A fleet of giants, built at extraordinary cost, gathered with extraordinary ambition, brought low in the space of a single day's fighting, by ships a fraction of their size and a fraction of their expense, commanded by a man who had understood, better than his enemies, what the sea does to grandeur when grandeur cannot turn quickly enough to save itself. There was no single dramatic collapse to mark the battle's end, no last stand fixed clearly in the record. There was only, gradually, less fighting, and then almost none, and then the slow settling of smoke over water that had been, that morning, the calmest anyone could remember. In the days that followed, the sea around Actium became a place of quiet reckoning. The great ships that had survived the battle did not all survive it in the same condition, and their fates taken together tell a story more varied and more human than any single image of fire or flight can hold. Some of the giants burned where they had been grappled, their timbers too soaked in pitch and too far gone in flame to be saved even after the fighting around them had ceased. Sailors who had fought aboard them in the morning could be found in the evening standing on the shore, watching the hulls that had been their world for months or years settle lower and lower into the water, until only a blackened rib or a fragment of stern showed above the surface. Other ships, less badly damaged, were captured outright, their crews taken prisoner, or, in a number of cases, the sources hint at, without confirming in detail, absorbed with little resistance into the fleet that had just defeated them. Sailors being sailors first, and partisans of a cause second, especially once the cause had visibly begun to fail. And a smaller number of the great vessels were scuttled by their own crews, deliberately sent to the bottom rather than surrendered, in acts that the surviving accounts treat with a certain respect, as if even in defeat there was a way to keep something intact that capture would have taken. What remained afloat, and there was still a considerable amount that did, passed into the hands of the victor as a matter of course, in the way that the material world always eventually settles itself onto whoever remains standing at the end of a contest. Octavian, or the men who served under him, moved through the aftermath with the practical thoroughness of an administration already thinking past the moment of victory toward the shape of what would come next. Ships were assessed, sorted, and in many cases simply taken into Roman service. Their names sometimes changed, their crews reorganized, their timbers surveyed for what use they might still offer. The polyremes among them, those wide and towering constructions that Antony and Cleopatra had gathered at such expense, proved in this new context to be as unwieldy an inheritance as they had been an unwieldy weapon. A ship built to project the wealth and reach of a kingdom does not shrink easily into an ordinary unit of a working navy, and the record suggests that many of the largest captured vessels were kept not for continued service at sea, but for something closer to display, floating monuments to a victory that Octavian intended no one to forget. That intention found its clearest expression at Actium itself, at Nicopolis, the city of victory that Octavian founded on the site to commemorate what had happened on the water nearby. Among the offerings raised there, the bronze rams, stripped from captured ships, were mounted along a monument facing the sea, a row of prows frozen in a permanent gesture of arrival, each one a fragment of a vessel that no longer existed in any other form. It was a gesture with old roots in the Mediterranean world. This practice of taking the sharp iron or bronze teeth from an enemy's ships and setting them into stone where they could be read, in a sense, the way a later age might read a name carved into a memorial. The rams at Nicopolis said, without needing further explanation, that these ships had come, had fought, and had lost, and that the man who now controlled them wished the fact to be visible for as long as the stone endured. Some of those mounting holes survive to this day, cut into the surviving foundation, empty now of the metal they once held, but still legible as sockets shaped for a purpose, a kind of negative record of ships that otherwise left almost nothing behind. Beyond the monument, the practical absorption of the fleet continued in quieter ways. Rome, now effectively under the control of one man, had little use for maintaining two great battle fleets when one would do, and the years following Actium saw a steady consolidation of naval power into a smaller number of well-organized fleets stationed at strategic harbors, forerunners of the standing squadrons that would guard the empire's coasts for generations. The lighter, faster ships that had proven themselves so capable in the battle were kept in active service, and, in time, became the standard around which future construction was planned. The polyremes, by contrast, entered a slower kind of retirement. A handful may have lingered in ceremonial or harbour guard roles for some years, too impressive to simply break apart, too impractical to use as anything but a symbol. But as decades passed, and as the men who had commissioned and captained them also passed from the world, the great ships themselves went the way that even the largest built things eventually go, dismantled for their timber and metal, or left to rot quietly in whatever mooring had become their final resting place, unrecorded and unmourned by any source that has survived to the present. It is one of the quieter facts of naval history that Actium marks, with unusual clarity, both an ending and a beginning. The battle did not simply decide who would rule Rome. It settled, almost as a side effect, a much older question about what kind of ship the ancient world would build going forward. For nearly 3 centuries before Actium, Mediterranean navies had drifted toward ever larger warships, driven by the same instinct that had built pyramids and raised colossal statues. The belief that scale itself was a form of power, that a bigger ship was, almost by definition, a stronger one. Antony and Cleopatra's fleet represented something close to the furthest reasonable extension of that belief. An armada built at the very edge of what harbors and treasuries and timber supplies could support. Its defeat by a lighter, more maneuverable force did not by itself end the age of the giant warship, but it removed, in a single afternoon, the fleet that might have justified continuing to build them, and it left standing as the only major power in the Mediterranean, a state that had just demonstrated, at great cost to its rival, the advantages of restraint Within a century, the polyreme as a class had essentially disappeared from active service, remembered mostly in inscriptions and in the writings of historians describing battles that had already receded into the past. Rome's navy, and the navies that followed in the centuries after Rome, would build lean, would build for speed and coordination, would treat the sea less as a stage for grandeur and more as a medium to be mastered through discipline. The great ships of Actium, in this sense, were not simply defeated. They were, in the quiet unfolding of subsequent decades, made obsolete by the very battle that destroyed them. Their loss becoming also the loss of an entire philosophy of shipbuilding that had taken 300 years to develop and less than one day to be proven wanting. For Antony and Cleopatra, the aftermath unfolded with a speed that must have felt, to those closest to them, like watching a structure collapse floor by floor. The accounts describe Cleopatra's ships slipping away from the fighting with sails set, moving southward and eastward toward Egypt, and Antony, according to the sources that survive, following in her wake, leaving the greater part of his army and fleet to their fate on the Greek coast. What forces remained ashore, uncertain of their commander's whereabouts, and increasingly aware that the man who had promised them victory had left the field, began within days to surrender or disperse, entire legions changing allegiance without further fighting, a dissolution as gradual and as total as the battle itself had been. Antony and Cleopatra reached Alexandria to find a court already beginning to calculate its own survival, and the year that followed brought them nothing that could meaningfully be called recovery. Only a slow, well-documented unraveling that ended, within months, in both their deaths and the final absorption of Egypt into Roman control. The sources that record these final months do so with a certain restraint, as if even ancient historians, given to embellishment elsewhere, sensed there was little need to add drama to an ending that carried its own weight without assistance. What remains, when the smoke and the monuments and the political consequences are set aside, is the fleet itself, or what became of it, a great concentration of wealth and craftsmanship and ambition that existed for a handful of years, met its defining test on a single morning, and then dispersed, some of it into flame, some of it into Roman service, some of it into the quiet erosion of time that eventually claims every ship, whether it wins its battles or loses them. The giants of Actium did not vanish all at once, and they did not vanish for the same reasons, but they vanished nonetheless. And what took their place on the sea was smaller, faster, and built by people who had learned, from watching them burn, exactly what the sea asks of anything that hopes to survive upon it. The water at Actium settled long before the world did. In the weeks that followed the battle, the smoke that had hung over the Gulf dispersed into the ordinary haze of a Mediterranean autumn, and the coastline returned, on its surface, to the quiet it had known before two fleets had gathered there to decide the fate of an empire. But nothing about the world was quiet beneath that surface. Octavian, who had stood on the deck of a lighter, faster ship and watched the giants of his rival burn or scatter or surrender, now held in his hands something no Roman had held outright in generations: the undisputed mastery of the Mediterranean, and with it, the undisputed mastery of Rome itself. He did not rush to claim the full weight of that mastery. This, more than any single tactical decision at Actium, may have been Octavian's greatest talent: the patience to let power settle into place gradually, so that it might resemble restoration rather than seizure. Antony's remaining forces in Egypt were not immediately pursued with reckless haste. Cleopatra's court was not stormed in the days after the battle. Octavian allowed the news of Actium to travel ahead of him, allowed the story of the victory to take root in the minds of soldiers and senators and provincial governors long before he arrived to collect the loyalty that story had already begun to produce. By the time he did move against Alexandria the following year, resistance had thinned to almost nothing. Antony and Cleopatra were already in the minds of much of the Roman world, figures from a story that had ended at Actium, even though their actual deaths were still to come. When Octavian returned to Rome, he did not return as a general reporting a victory. He returned as something closer to a force of restoration, the man who had ended, at last, the long cycle of civil war that had consumed the Republic for the better part of a century. Actium was framed, carefully and repeatedly, not as one Roman defeating another Roman, but as Rome defeating a foreign queen and the corrupted, orientalized version of a Roman general who had fallen under her influence. This framing mattered enormously, because it allowed Octavian's victory to be celebrated as a national triumph rather than mourned as a fratricide, and it allowed the giant ships of Antony's fleet to be remembered not as Roman vessels lost, but as symbols of an excess and a foreignness that Rome had rightly overcome. 4 years after the battle, in a ceremony whose details are recorded with more confidence than most events of the ancient world, Octavian took the name Augustus, and in doing so completed the transformation of Rome from a republic governed, however imperfectly, by its citizens, into an empire governed by one man wearing the careful costume of restored tradition. Actium was not the only step in that transformation, but it was, in the way that later Romans themselves chose to remember it, the decisive one. The battle after which there was no longer a rival fleet, no longer a rival army, no longer, in any meaningful sense, a rival. The victory was commemorated with the seriousness that Rome reserved for its most important stories. Coins were struck bearing images of the battle and of Augustus himself as its architect, circulating the memory of Actium through every marketplace and treasury in the growing empire, long after those who had actually fought there had died of old age. Temples were built or rededicated in Actium's honor. In Rome, the Senate voted honors and monuments that tied the new peace directly to the naval victory that had secured it, embedding Actium into the civic memory of the city in stone and bronze that would long outlast anyone's direct recollection of the smoke and the noise. At the battle site itself, Augustus ordered the construction of a monument unlike almost anything else from the ancient naval world, a trophy built not from marble alone, but incorporating the actual bronze rams taken from the captured ships of Antony's fleet, mounted into a stone platform on the headland overlooking the gulf where the battle had been fought. It was, in its way, one of the most literal war memorials the ancient world produced. A wall built partly from the weapons of the defeated, standing permanently at the exact place where those weapons had failed. For centuries afterward, travelers along that coast could see the sockets where the rams had once been fixed, could stand at the promontory and understand, without needing a single word of explanation, that something enormous had happened there. The rams themselves are largely gone now, stripped away by time and by later hands, but the foundation of the monument survives, and archaeologists working at the site in recent decades have been able to measure the sockets and estimate, from their size and spacing, something of the scale of the ships whose rams once filled them, one of the few physical traces the giants of Actium left directly upon the land. What followed the battle, for the Mediterranean as a whole, was something the ancient world had rarely known and would not know again for centuries: an extended, genuine peace at sea. With Antony's fleet destroyed and no other power remaining capable of contesting Roman naval supremacy, the waters that had carried war fleets back and forth for generations became, gradually, waters carrying trade instead. Piracy, which had plagued Mediterranean shipping for centuries, and which earlier Roman commanders had fought without ever fully suppressing, was brought under a level of control it had never previously known, enforced by a Roman navy that no longer needed to hold vast reserves against a rival power, and could instead turn its attention to policing. Grain ships moved from Egypt to Rome with a reliability that the city had never before enjoyed. Merchants and travelers crossed waters that, within living memory, had been choked with war fleets, preparing for exactly the kind of confrontation that had unfolded at Actium. This peace, sometimes called by later historians the maritime dimension of the Pax Romana, was not the product of treaties or diplomatic balance. It was the product of overwhelming, unchallenged force, the direct inheritance of a battle in which one fleet had been annihilated and the other had absorbed whatever remained worth keeping. The Mediterranean was calm in the decades after Actium, largely because there was no longer anyone left with a fleet capable of disturbing it. And within that calm, the great shipbuilding tradition that had produced Antony's giants began, quietly and without ceremony, to fade. The Hellenistic kingdoms that had once competed with one another to build ever larger warships, the great polyremes with their multiplying banks of oarsmen, the floating fortresses meant to overawe rivals as much as to fight them, no longer had rivals to overawe. Egypt's independent naval power ended with Cleopatra's defeat. The old Macedonian and Rhodian traditions of shipbuilding, already diminished by decades of war and shifting patronage, found themselves without the kind of ambitious royal sponsorship that had once funded ships built purely to demonstrate the size of a ruler's imagination. In their place, the Roman standard spread, not through any single decree, but through the simple mathematics of surviving practicality. Rome had never particularly needed giants. The quinquereme and vessels smaller still had done the empire's naval work reliably for generations, and the lessons of Actium, where a scattering of the largest ships in Antony's fleet had proven less decisive than their builders had hoped, hampered by their own draft and their own slowness in exactly the conditions the battle produced, did nothing to change Rome's preference for that standard. As the decades passed and the Mediterranean settled into a peace enforced by a single power, with no need to impress or intimidate a rival empire, the shipyards that had once built 5 and 6 and 10-row Leviathans simply stopped receiving commissions for them. There was no institutional memory to preserve, no urgent successor project to inherit their techniques. The knowledge of how to design and lay the keel of a true polyreme, refined over generations of Hellenistic competition, began to disperse along with the shipwrights who held it, and within a few generations, no one anywhere in the Mediterranean world was building ships of that scale, because no one anywhere needed to, and few remembered exactly how. What survived of the giants in the centuries that followed was mostly not wood or bronze, but words. Historians writing decades or centuries after Actium, drawing on earlier accounts now lost, on official records, on the memories of a war that had shaped the political world they lived in, described the great ships in prose, estimated their size, occasionally speculated on their oar arrangements, and passed those descriptions forward to later readers who had never seen anything like them, and, increasingly, could not quite conceive of a ship that large existing at all. The physical ships themselves, burned or scuttled or broken up for the materials still worth salvaging, left almost nothing behind for those readers to actually examine. The giants of Actium became, within a few generations of their destruction, creatures of literature more than creatures of history in any tangible sense. Remembered, discussed, occasionally doubted, but no longer seen, no longer touched. No longer anything but the careful, second-hand testimony of people trying to describe a scale of shipbuilding that the world that came after them had simply stopped attempting to reproduce. That absence has shaped everything that has come after. For centuries, anyone wishing to understand the great ships of Actium had only the words of Plutarch, of Cassius Dio, of the poets who sang of Actium as the moment the old world gave way to the new. And each writer had reasons of his own for making the ships larger or smaller, more monstrous or more magnificent than they had actually been. It was not until the modern era, with its slow, patient tools of survey and excavation, that anyone began asking whether the sea itself might still be holding some fragment of the truth. some scrap of bronze or timber that had escaped both the fires of the battle and the long scavenging that followed it. The Ambracian Gulf, that quiet stretch of water where Antony's fleet had once lain at anchor and where the battle had unfolded in its final hours, became in the 20th century a place of renewed attention, not from admirals or historians reading old texts by candlelight, but from archaeologists and divers willing to work in the mud and silt where 2,000 years of sediment had settled over whatever the ancient world had left behind. The search was never going to be simple, and those who undertook it understood this from the outset. A naval battle fought in open or semi-open water does not leave a wreck site in the way a single sinking ship might, resting whole and recognizable on a seabed for divers to find intact. Actium had scattered its dead across miles of gulf and coastline, and the ships that burned had burned mostly on the surface, their timbers reduced to ash and their metal fittings falling separately, unevenly, into water of varying depth and character. Some of it silted and soft, some of it rocky and exposed to currents that would have scattered debris further still over the centuries that followed. Anything that survived would not survive as a ship. It would survive as fragments, a ram here, a fitting there, a scatter of nails or sheathing that a diver might mistake, without careful attention, for nothing more than corroded refuse of no particular age. And yet fragments did begin to surface, both literally and in the patient records of survey teams working the coastal waters near where the battle had been fought. Bronze rams, the great pointed prow fittings that had been the signature weapon of ancient galleys for centuries, were among the most significant finds, because a ram carries information a plain timber never could. Its size speaks to the size of the vessel it was mounted on. Its shape speaks to the era and school of shipbuilding that produced it. Its weight speaks to the force it was designed to deliver, and, by extension, the mass of ship required to deliver that force without shattering itself in the process. When rams believed to date from the period of the late Republic, and the wars between Antony and Octavian began to be recovered from waters associated with the region, or from earlier related conflicts in the same naval tradition, historians who had spent careers reading Plutarch's descriptions of towering ships finally had something to measure those descriptions against, however imperfectly, however far removed from a complete and legible answer. The most substantial body of such evidence did not come from Actium itself, but from a related engagement, the Battle of the Agadi Islands, fought more than 2 centuries earlier during the First Punic War, where marine archaeologists in more recent decades recovered a remarkable series of bronze rams from the seabed off Sicily. These rams, cast and inscribed with markings that allowed scholars to associate them with specific vessels and campaigns, offered the first substantial physical dataset for understanding the scale of ancient war galleys in general, even though they predated the ships of Antony and Cleopatra by generations. The rams recovered, there tended to suggest vessels considerably smaller, in most cases, than the literary traditions surrounding the giants of Actium might lead a reader to expect, solid evidence of quinqueremes and similar mid-sized warships that had formed the backbone of Mediterranean navies for centuries. Ships whose dimensions matched reasonably well with practical experience and with what shipwrights of any era, ancient or modern, would recognize as buildable and seaworthy. This evidence, while not drawn from Actium's own waters, became central to the scholarly debate that has surrounded the giants of Antony's fleet ever since, because it offered a baseline against which the literary claims of massive, multi-tiered ships, ships of 8, 9, 10 banks of oars or more, could be tested and, in the view of many historians, found wanting. If the standard warship of the ancient Mediterranean, built across centuries of accumulated experience and tested in dozens of major engagements, settled reliably around the scale of a quinquereme or a slightly larger variant, then a claim of galleys many times that size carrying oars in some arrangement running to 8 or 9 or 10 levels, began to look increasingly like a claim requiring extraordinary evidence. Evidence that the archaeological record, thin as it remains, has simply not yet produced in any conclusive form. Surveys conducted nearer to the Ambracian Gulf itself, meanwhile, have added their own scattered pieces to this puzzle, though nothing on the scale of the Agadi discoveries. Divers working the coastal shallows near the presumed sites of the fleet's anchorages have recovered hull fittings, fragments of lead sheathing once used to protect wooden hulls from marine growth and boring worms, and occasional pieces of bronze that may once have formed part of decorative or structural fittings on larger vessels. None of these finds has been substantial enough, or well enough preserved, to allow for the kind of confident reconstruction that the Agadi rams permitted for the ships of the First Punic War. The Gulf's waters, shifting sediment over 2 millennia, coastal development along much of its shoreline, and the sheer difficulty of surveying a battle site so much larger and more dispersed than a single ship's resting place, have all conspired to keep the physical record of Actium itself frustratingly incomplete, a scatter of possibilities rather than a coherent picture. What has emerged from this slow, careful work is not a resolution to the old debate, but a sharpened version of it, argued now with the tools of naval architecture and engineering feasibility, rather than simply the comparative reading of ancient texts. Scholars who lean toward skepticism about the giant ships point to the practical difficulties any shipwright would have faced in building a vessel with anywhere near 10 levels of oars. Difficulties involving the geometry of oar angles, the strength of timber joinery at that scale, the sheer weight of a hull tall enough to house that many rowing benches, and the near impossibility of coordinating rowers across so many staggered levels without some of them striking the water at angles too shallow or too steep to contribute meaningful power. These scholars tend to argue that the numbers given by ancient writers describing tens and similar figures likely referred not to physical banks of oars stacked one above another, but to the number of rowers assigned to each oar, or to groupings of oars along the hull, an arrangement that would allow for enormous vessels with correspondingly enormous crews without requiring the physically implausible architecture that a literal reading of 10 banks would demand. Others, more cautious about dismissing the ancient testimony too readily, note that the ancient world's shipwrights operated with centuries of accumulated craft knowledge that no longer survives in any technical form, and that dismissing a description simply because it strains modern intuitions about naval architecture risks underestimating the ingenuity of builders working within a tradition of experimentation that had already produced vessels far larger than anything the medieval or early modern world would attempt for more than 1,000 years afterward. The Syracusia, the Isis, and the ceremonial barges of the Ptolemaic court all stood as evidence, in this view, that the ancient Mediterranean was entirely capable of building at scales that later ages found almost unbelievable, and that Actium's giants, whatever their exact configuration of oars, likely represented a similar triumph of ambition over easy replication. The debate, then, remains genuinely open, and honest historians studying Actium acknowledge this, rather than pretending toward a certainty the evidence does not support. The ships were large. This much can be stated with confidence, given the consistent testimony of multiple ancient sources and the broader context of Hellenistic naval architecture that produced them. Precisely how large, measured in banks of oars or overall length or displacement in the terms a modern naval engineer might use, remains a question the sea has not yet answered and may never fully answer, given how little of Actium's fleets survived the battle's aftermath in any recoverable form. What the searchers along that gulf have found instead is not the fleet itself, but the outline of an argument, a scattering of bronze and lead, sufficient to keep the question alive without settling it, sufficient to remind each new generation of divers and historians that somewhere beneath that quiet water, or perhaps nowhere at all, lies whatever remains of the answer to how large a warship the ancient world was truly willing and able to build.